get a good picture of the significance of Sino-Australian economic ties, it is instrumental to look at some key figures. China is currently Australia's largest trading partner, and Australia is China's sixth largest trading partner, the fifth biggest supplier of imports, and the 10th biggest market for exports. The two countries signed a free trade agreement in 2015, and since then, Australia's agricultural exports to China have seen dramatic growth. With the fifth round of tariffs cuts under the free trade agreement between the two sides to be rolled out in January next year, what new opportunities can the two sides pursue? How will the supply and demand of the services industry from both sides complement each other? On the sideline of the first China International Import Expo, I'm pleased to be joined by Honorary Andrew Robb, former Minister for Trade and Investment of Australia, who negotiated and signed the free trade agreement with China on behalf of his country. Honorary Andrew Robb, former Minister for Trade and Investment Australia, thank you very much for accepting this interview.
My pleasure.
I understand that there are nearly 120 companies with 150 brands from Australia which are present during this year's International Import Expo. How do you look at the timing and significance of this expo, especially for Australia and within the context of trade protectionism and unilateralism?
Well, close to home in Australia, it's very timely. It's only a bit over 2 years since we completed the free trade agreement with China, which has seen a 37% increase in trade, which is phenomenal. But at the same time, from a global point of view, with the United States now reverting back to protectionism and disrupting supply chains, this is a very strong signal to the world, I think, that China is putting that to one side and is still opening up their economy. So it's an act of leadership in that sense, global leadership, to see so many people here for such an auspicious occasion.
How do you explain the presence of Australia, for instance? How big is it in your eyes? Is it big? Is it moderate? Is it small?
Well, it's very important. I mean, we're China's seventh biggest trading partner. Of course, China is our biggest trading partner, as it is for about 150 other countries. But for both parties, we've got a big relationship. And this expo, which focuses on imports, it provides an opportunity for Australia to showcase so much of what the free trade agreement makes possible. So it's very, very lucky timing, I think, for us. But as I say, it's got wider significance in a global sense.
Well, let's talk about this free trade agreement. You negotiated while you were still Minister of Trade and Investment of Australia. You spent a long time, right? The entire negotiations span a decade.
Yes.
And this is one of the most liberalized trade agreement that China has with any country in the world, and it only took in effect in 2015. So looking ahead, looking back at what has been achieved over the past 3 years, what kind of changes has it brought to the Australian side, and what kind of opportunities or challenges do you think can still be tapped into?
Yes, well, it's, as you say, it's in fact the only free trade agreement with a G20 country, and all of the establishment, if you like, in the trade sector around the world have marked it as a very what they call ambitious and high quality agreement. In other words, there is a lot of reduction there's gradual protection since 2015, but from 2019 there won't be one product that comes in from China to Australia that attracts a tariff. Zero tariff for all products from China from the start of 2019. So that just shows you how dramatic the agreement is. Secondly, for the benefits for Australia have been very significant.
What's the other way around? For Australian goods to go into China, what kind of tariff are they looking at?
Well, it's more difficult for China because less developed, but So there were some products which we didn't see any change in, things like sugar and rice and a couple of oil seeds. We saw no change, and that was for good reason, because there's still, China has seen 500 million people come out of poverty since they opened up, since you opened up.
Yes.
But there's still 300 million people relatively poor, and the staple production of those communities were some of those products. So we had to make some allowances because of the development stage of China, but we will still see, in something in the order of well in the high 90s% free of tariffs, probably a little bit longer, but still very important for Australia. We're seeing, as I said, we've seen a 37% increase in non-mineral and resource products.
Yeah.
They've always been very large, but it's been quite dramatic, and especially with agriculture. The clean, green, healthy agriculture is in big demand up here, especially through the e-commerce platforms, but also the services. This agreement broke ground for any developing country. Normally they keep a big door shut on services. China opened up to so many services in health and education and water management and you name it, hundreds of areas, and it does provide Australia with lots of opportunity in the years and months ahead.
Indeed, as I mentioned, actually the overall volume of trade, according to Trade and Services Australia report that was published by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, showed that trade and services reached already a record high for last year. And now that China is further opening market access of the third industry, what kind of opportunities specifically is Australia eyeing under this wave of opening up?
Well, in association with this Import Expo, which is, the biggest and brightest ever, I think. I don't know of an Import Expo that anyone else has held of any consequence. So this is very significant in terms of the approach being taken by China. It's allowing the world to showcase their wares to Chinese merchants and other business people, so that their products can be sold here, introduce other products to the Chinese market. So it's a very open policy and an initiative, but in association with that, and of course it's the 40th year since China opened up to the world, and in association with this expo, there's been a number of announcements already, a lot in the financial area. So with insurance and all sorts of financial products, the amount of ownership that foreigners can have of banks, etc., etc. Now, that is an area of particular strength of Australia, financial services, so I would expect a lot of enthusiasm and also opportunity being taken in Australia. We've also got still a lot of areas that we haven't made good use of yet from a free trade agreement in health. Hundreds of concessions given in the health sector that other countries haven't got. Education, skills, training, water management, geology, all sorts of areas, which it's an exciting future between us, given these trade agreements and the continuing attitude of the Chinese government and of the President to open up China, to continue to show that opening your economy is the way to improve jobs and to improve incomes and to get people out of poverty.
Yeah. Well, being the only country within the G20 to have a free trade agreement with China, what would you say to the other countries that are either hesitant, that are still thinking about it, or having difficulties in reaching this kind of deal with China, which many are labelling as a non-market economy?
Yeah, well, I'd firstly say to them, get with it. Okay. I mean, there's got to be a determination. I mean, in Australia, we had a history of, in the last century, in the 20th century, that for 70 years we were a highly regulated, closed economy. And I've lived through all this, and I've seen us open up in the 80s and the 90s, and we've now got hardly any protection against hardly any goods or services. And I've seen us, we've had now 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. In other words, we're the only country in the G20 that hasn't had a recession in well over a quarter of a century. And a lot of that, I would say, is because we opened up as an economy. So I've always been enthusiastic, very enthusiastic, and I'm spending a lot of my time post-politics up here to try and encourage trade and investment both ways between China and Australia.
Yeah. Well, speaking of your attitude on trade, you participated in the negotiation between Australia with South Korea and Japan, the free trade agreement there, and then also the TPP, the formal version of the TPP, and also the comprehensive strategic partnership with Singapore. What makes you such a strong supporter of free trade and trade liberalisation?
Well, it is that earlier experience of mine where I was brought up and actually trained as an economist at a time when we had in Australia endless restrictions and regulations, and it was very difficult for people to do business with Australia in many respects. And then when we opened up, I was at a time of my career where I saw so many business opportunities that trade made possible, freeing up the economy, freeing up the exchange rate, taking controls off interest rates, letting the market make all these determinations because it's so complex. Mere mortals haven't got the opportunity or the capacity to do it. So all of those things which China is progressively embracing, I've seen work for Australia, and there's nothing special about Australia. If it works there, it'll work anywhere, in my view. So that's made me a very strong advocate for trade and agreement. And when you put these arguments, when I did with Korea, Japan, etc., people do see the evidence. The evidence is there.
However, most recently, for instance, in October in Wuhan, you said that 2019 will be a year of continued uncertainty and global headwinds against growth as a result of US President Donald Trump's policy of trade barriers and his attack on the global supply chain. So what kind of uncertainty are you most concerned about, and how do you see the global supply chain being reshaped?
Well, it all depends. Well, largely depends on how President Trump plays whatever he's up to at the present time. I mean, he has thrown a big spanner in the works, as we say. He's caused a lot of ripples out there, a lot of uncertainty. That's the uncertainty I'm talking about. Will he continue to go harder and harder and harder on tariffs, as he's saying he will? Will he continue to break up all these supply chains, as he said he will? I mean, I read the US papers and the United States papers. There's industries like the car industry, they're complaining already that it's costing them, even though it's supposed to create job opportunities. The industry is paying a fortune because of the tariffs on parts that come out of places like China. So I think he's fundamentally got it wrong. It's not an answer. It's a political answer in the short term. As an economic strategy, to me, it's going to do a lot of damage, but on the way through, not just to the United States, but to so many other economies in the world. So that's the fear that I've got. It depends, but at the same time, I am encouraged that economies as large as China are continuing to say they're not going to let that get in the way of further opening up to the rest of the world. So who knows? We'll see what happens, but it is an uncertain period, and a lot of businesses are trying to make decisions about the next 12 months, 2 years. Against the backdrop of that.
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is actually one of the things that China has been trying to do to diversify its international trade, and we know that the state of Victoria in Australia has already signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the Chinese government on this initiative. However, it's the only Australian state or territory to have done so far, and basically voices of skepticism have dominated the conversation. Where do you think this kind of skepticism have come from, and how can any misunderstanding or mistrust be dealt with so that Australia could take more benefit out of this initiative?
Well, it's a good question. I do think that to be fair to the Australian government, and it's okay, the state has signed a memorandum. They've been very active with China, the state of Victoria, done a great job in relationships, but Normally these things are properly addressed at the national level. Doesn't stop the states doing what they're doing, that's fine. But the national government has been a bit cautious, and the reason, I think, is that they didn't want to support something where the rules that applied to projects being financed, etc., were not transparent, and there wasn't necessarily good governance. That wasn't made clear at the outset. Now, I've been in Beijing last week with a delegation from Australia of business people, and what had become very clear in the last 12 months is that China has adopted the same governance standards, the same principles of transparency, etc., that the World Bank applies to its funding, that the Asia Development Bank applies to its, and that the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So I think it'll make a huge difference to the attitude of the Australian government and give them comfort that these investments will in fact be properly governed.
Very much Honorary Andrew Robb, a former Australian Minister for Trade and Investment.
That's mine. Thank you very much.
High quality milk powder, butter and cheese. All these export products from New Zealand are widely welcomed by ordinary Chinese people. They also reflect the robust bilateral trade and economic ties over the years. How can China and New Zealand work together to extend beyond their trading relationship and into areas like people-to-people exchanges and media cooperation? As China is rising as a global economic powerhouse, how can it tell its story from an international perspective? In the second part of the show, I talk to Kyle Murdoch, Managing Director of NHNZ, a New Zealand-based production company. So, Mr. Murdoch, thank you very much for accepting the interview. In terms of providing factual content or unscripted content to and in collaboration with the Chinese partners, how do you see the significance of the Import Expo?
Well, I think the clear message has been about opening up and being more open about doing business with Western countries, but also openness about the type of things we do. So, you know, making a documentary about China for the international market is something that NHNZ has been doing for the last almost 20 years. And so I think there's clearly more opportunities for expanding on the work that we do. And we've certainly been expanding since we started making just single one-off documentaries 20 years ago. We now make children's television, animation, and a range of factual content with different Chinese partners from all over China.
Looking ahead, how do you see the prospects of more imports of your content into China, and maybe the other way around as well?
I think, you know, Chinese viewers and consumers consume content voraciously, and I think that there's a growing demand for premium stories. So viewers see the benefit of having a range of content that they can watch whenever they want, online, also free-to-air, satellite, in the cinemas. And so I think, you know, our partners, in particular in China, a range of partners, are looking for different ways of providing that content for viewers.
Do you see right now the approaches to a bigger market here in China? I mean, are you being facilitated to tap into the huge market that China is opening up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Back in 2014, Xi Jinping was in New Zealand, and he signed the New Zealand-China co-production treaty with John Key, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time. And that also sent a very clear signal for both companies in New Zealand and media companies in China to encourage to cooperate and co-produce together. And this is almost like another signal, isn't it? It's like a next step as well to say that you know, China is open for business in this way.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the projects in the pipeline? What are the stories that the Chinese are most hungry about?
Well, it's really interesting because I think the type of shows that we make are quite localized. The stories about China, and one series in particular, China from Above, has done very well here. And it's a co-production between CIIE in China and National Geographic Channel International, and also Smithsonian Channel in the US. And so we've got this ability to tell, with our Chinese partners facilitation, we can show China from an aerial perspective. And of course, you know, it's one of the most highly regulated airspaces in the world, and we have this ability to tell this unique story, and we certainly wouldn't have been able to do that without a Chinese partner. That's one that's resonated really well here in China. It played on, the first series went on the air on Tencent, and I think it's had 250 million views, because even Chinese viewers are very curious to see, you know, what China looked like from the air.
Yeah. What are some of the stories that the international market are looking out of China? You talked about China from Above, right? What other contents are being explored at this moment, and in the future, what do you think this is going? Where do you think this is going?
Well, I think, you know, especially we always find that international viewers have a basic understanding of China, and there's a curiosity to find out more. There's always really a lot of interest in Chinese ancient history, because, you know, we have 4,000 years of history. It's more than anywhere else in the world, and so I think Western viewers are always very interested in that. They're also really interested in the sort of wilderness stories, natural history stories about China. You have vast areas with very you know, interesting and dynamic landscapes and animals, and I think that also resonates. Anywhere where there's unique access, where you can give people a perspective that they wouldn't be able to find anywhere in a magazine or in a book or another TV program.
Well, an interesting thing to me is that China changed from the world's, let's say, number 11 exporter to being the world's number 1 trading nation in just a matter of a few decades. And yet, do you think there is rather, do you think that the understanding of the world of China is lagging behind their interaction in trade with China? And how can that gap be filled in the near future?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I think whenever you have different people from different countries, geographically separated by language, by culture, you're always going to have a little bit of displacement and misunderstanding in that way. You're quite right. It's the number 1 exporter. It's now the number 2 in terms of media value in the world. Overtook the UK recently in terms of the amount of money spent on media, television, film production. And so I think, you know, there will be always a little bit of a lag where there's not a very quick understanding of how people in a society operate. I'm not sure what can be done to sort of rectify that lag in a way, but I think that the amount of content that goes out, the access to different social media platforms that people are using now will definitely help.
Yeah. Do you think there is a better job that can be done on the part of Chinese content producers when they're telling the Chinese story abroad? What do you think they can do slightly better?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think about this, and I've worked in China for a long time, and when I first started working in China, there was a clear difference between how I would tell a story and how my Chinese friends would tell stories, and it was our upbringing. You know, I think traditionally Chinese documentary had been lectures to pictures, whereas maybe Western documentary more kind of a bit more Hollywood and entertainment and storytelling and dramatic flair. But I think over the years that there has been a shift. As China's opened up and allowed more different types of storytelling to be played, both on CCTV or in a theatre or online, it's influenced the way Chinese producers and directors tell their story. And so I think that opening up will help facilitate a growth in sort of more homegrown storytelling from Chinese producers to help, you know, tell stories internationally. And we do this a lot. We don't just we do true co-productions, so we'll work very closely with the CCTV crews we'll have a Chinese director and a New Zealand director work together to help tell that story, which is key.
But do you think that while the Chinese is adopting an international way of telling a story, do you think they might have also lost a little bit their way of telling the story? I mean, in the process of the globalization, of integration with the outside world, do you think about this kind of worries?
No, not really, because I think you know,
of course, from the business perspective.
Well, it's not just that, but I think that also as a storyteller myself, you know, good quality storytelling, it doesn't matter what language it's in, will always find an audience. And I think that that is key. You look in the way in which the BBC has developed their reputation for telling, say, natural history stories or drama, really high quality stories. It cuts borders, it cuts through geopolitical divisions or even language. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, you can always find a good audience for a great story, and I think that that's something that will develop in time. And there are some amazing stories being told homegrown here in China.
But are they being told in a Chinese way, or when you're co-producing with your Chinese partners, do you think about how to preserve the Chineseness of both the content and the way of the story to the maximum extent possible? Or otherwise in the end we all have of Hollywood style, they're entertaining, you know, but then...
I think one of the keys is when you do co-production like we do, and you work very closely with say CCTV, we always help, we always make sure CCTV knows the Chinese audience better than we do. And so at the end of the day, we may make a different version of the same story, but we're bringing together the best of aspects and producing stories that will work tailor-made for a particular audience. So I'm not sure that it'll necessarily, the Chineseness of the story will necessarily be lost in those particular cases.
Okay, well that's a good thing if it is not going to be. So looking ahead, are you seeing more co-production opportunities with your Chinese partners, stronger partnership along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we specialize in premium production, and I think there's always demand for really high quality productions across the board. It doesn't matter what the genre is. Good quality storytelling will always find a strong audience.
Hopefully the Chinese story will also be told better on the international audience with help of partners like you.
Yeah, well I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Murdoch from NHNZ.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.